Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to Business Law 1. This is Professor McKenzie. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 17, which involves an introduction to sales and leases. In terms of our overall learning objectives, I want us to be able to explain why the law of commercial transactions is separate from the common law. We'll talk about what is meant by commercial transactions and how the UCC, which is an acronym for the Uniform Commercial Code, has been developed over time. We'll talk about, in particular, UCC Article 2, because that is the article or the section of the UCC that covers the sale of goods, so of physical products. We'll also briefly discuss at the end of this chapter Article UCC 2A, which involves the leasing of goods. So if you see UCC 2, instantly think physical goods. If it's just UCC 2, it's sale of goods. If it's UCC 2A, then we're talking about the leasing of physical goods. We'll also talk about obligations that are similar under common law versus the UCC regarding to parties in an agreement involving the sale of goods, as well as differences between a consumer lease and a finance lease. So those are some of the basic things that we'll be looking at in this chapter today. So when we talk about the history of the UCC, obviously, post-independence, we were, a federal system of government. We had national laws, but then we also had separate state laws. And, for the better part of over a century, we kind of muddled through in terms of, we had a, kind of like a loose patchwork of state laws that for varying degrees or varying purposes served its purpose when we were an agrarian society. But by the time we got to the 20th century, and in particular post-World War II, when we really started to ramp up, our commercialization of different industries across the U.S., we saw the need for having more common, elements of the law on a state-by-state basis, or more parity. And so that was kind of like the genesis, or this idea that, well, maybe we should have a body of commercial law that we're trying to encourage all the states to gradually adopt, so that if you're going to be selling, from one state to another, we're trying to make it easier in order to kind of facilitate those transactions and not feel like it's overly burdensome, that you have to kind of, reinvent the wheel when every time you decide you're going to sell into a different state, because that's going to increase your transactional costs. So it's in that backdrop since the late 40s and early 1950s that we decided, well, maybe we do need to have this body of commercial law called the UCC. When we talk about the nature and form of sales, if we're talking about contract for services or maybe contracts for real property, that usually is governed by common law. The UCC, and in particular Article 2 and 2A that we're going to cover in this chapter predominantly, does not deal with services, does not deal with real property. It also doesn't deal with securities transactions, so if you're buying and selling shares of stock or bonds, or if you're dealing in intellectual property, such as copyrights, trademarks, patents, trade secrets. Those are things that don't come under this umbrella of UCC 2 or 2A. We're specifically looking at the sale of goods. So it can be either new goods that have been fabricated, or it could even be used goods. But if you're selling them, that's UCC 2. If you're leasing them, that's UCC 2A. The UCC overall has several different articles. They could have called them chapters or sections or divisions, but they went with articles. And I just wanted to kind of give you an overview so you kind of see the structure of what the UCC, how comprehensive it is in terms of the impact on commercial activity across the U.S. For our purposes in this course, we're only going to be looking at the sale and the leases of goods. So that's those first 2 points there. Virtually every other article we get into more detail in business law 2. So in business law 2, we talk about commercial paper, we talk about bank deposits, funds transfers, letters of credit. We get into investment securities and secure transactions later on in the course. But for our purposes, our focus predominantly in this class is going to be just mainly UCC Article 2 and then 2A. So When we're looking at the nature and legality of commercial transactions, so if we're talking about a sale of goods, that is a present transfer of title of tangible personal property for an established price. That's like a very basic definition kind of element of UCC 2. The following transactions are not sales. So bailment, which we haven't talked about, that's where you're allowing someone to use your property that you own for some temporary purpose. It could be out of your generosity. It could be as per like a lease agreement for consideration. But the idea with the bailment is that you're getting that property back. So that is not a sale. A gift is not a sale. You know, if you want to give a donation to a charity, a church, a nonprofit, whatever, it doesn't matter. That is not a contract for a sale. That is just a gift transaction. And also, if you're dealing with the contract for services, that again is covered by common law. That is not something that is covered by the UCC if it's purely just a service-based transaction. I discuss, well, what if you have in a contract, a combination of goods and services that are blended together? Would the UCC apply in that situation? And the answer is it depends. What we're going to look at is what is the dominant focus of the contract. I give the example here that if you buy a new computer, a lot of times whoever is selling you that computer wants to get you to sign up for like some kind of extended warranty or maybe installation service. And so, the core aspect of that contract is to buy a physical good, the computer. And so that's going to be governed by the UCC Article 2. Flip, the facts around a little bit, and let's say that, maybe you own a company and you're hiring a software vendor to come in and service your operating system for maybe your computers or the servers that you have at your particular location of business. And maybe from time to time they replace hardware. Maybe it's a computer, maybe it's RAM, maybe it's a hard drive, motherboard, something. So even though from time to time you may actually get a physical good that's blended in with your contract as part of like an invoice, the predominant reason why that contract exists in this alternate hypothetical is that it's a service that's being provided. So that would be common law. That would not be UCC Article 2A. So again, just get the notion that, well, if you do have blended together goods and services, what's the dominant aspect of that contract? That will tell you what law applies, UCC or just common law. So if we're looking at the subject matter and the quantity, normally as we've discussed in previous chapters and contracts, we want those terms to be definite. So what am I specifically buying? What is the quantity that's being ordered? However, under the UCC, they do provide for some unique flexibility there if you're not sure on the subject matter or the quantity at the time the agreement was drafted. There's also this idea of what's called an offer. And if you remember when we talked originally about an offer, if you have a counter offer, remember that's a rejection of the original offer. And so then, you kind of are switching roles in that flow chart, if you remember when we talked about that. But if you're a merchant, meaning you're a business, and you're dealing with another, let's say, merchant, so maybe it's manufacturer to wholesaler, wholesaler to retailer, you could have what's called a firm offer. And sometimes that's also called an irrevocable offer. So let's say I'm a wholesaler and you're a retailer, and I approach you and I say I'm selling office equipment or inventory, whatever, and for the next 30 days, this is the price. Maybe it's a sale. I'm trying to drum up new clients. And so if I satisfy the requirements that this is now a firm or irrevocable offer, you have 30 days to decide. If normally when an offer is floated out there, if there's no response, you can take it back. But with the firm offer, that's not going to be the case. Again, if you follow those requirements where it's in writing and it's between merchants and so on. Other than that, if you just put an offer out there, acceptance usually is made, whatever is considered in a reasonable time manner for the nature of what is being contracted. When it comes to additional terms, if you're dealing with, if one or both of the parties are non-merchants, so they're just average persons. Then what we have is the mirror image rule. And that what that means is that the offer and the acceptance have to mirror each other identically. Each party has to be on the same page when it comes to the specifics of an agreement. If you're dealing, let's say, between merchants, so again, manufacturer, wholesaler, retailer, whatever permutation you have there, because they're merchants and they're considered to be more savvy, then we have what's called battle of the forms. And so maybe an initial offer is made, hey, would you like to buy this inventory? And maybe the recipient would be like, okay, sure, I'll buy it at this price. But maybe they add some additional terms. Maybe I want you to throw in a short-term warranty. Maybe I want you to deliver it in a specific manner. That was not in the original offer. As long as it doesn't substantively change the original agreement, if the other side doesn't object, usually within 10 calendar days, then it becomes folded and it's part of the overall contract. So the mirror image rule is something that's strictly applied when you're dealing with a non-merchant, or if the contract is just between two non-merchants. But if you're dealing with merchants exclusively, courts give a little bit more flexibility and adaptability off of that mirror image requirement. Defenses to formation, so the same defenses that we've been talking about for the past few chapters: lack of capacity, mistake, deception, illegality, undue pressure. Those would all be normal defenses that you could assert in a UCC Article 2 transaction. The UCC also recognizes unconscionability, and remember, we talked about, different facets of unconscionability. There's the procedural and the substantive. So again, those also come into play for UCC type contracts. The UCC tries to pull from existing bodies of law, like the common law, and fold it in as it's trying to fashion a more standardized approach to situations that can arise in commercial transactions across the country. Open terms under the UCC, you don't necessarily have to have items like price. That could be left open, or even quantity. The only thing that is required in UCC 2 agreements would be, well, is there some way to figure out or discern what that is going to be, price or quantity? Gasoline is a great example. For those that are in the industry, if you're extracting oil, if you're refining it, or if you're a retailer where you're selling gas at the pump, no one knows what gas is going to be priced, 6 months from now, let alone tomorrow. And in all these contracts that are providing for the delivery of crude oil to refineries, or from refineries, fuel that can be dispensed from a pump to gas stations, there's a formula that's in place based on whatever the market prices and conditions are at that time. So, in those types of contracts, you're not going to have the specifics of how much is this fuel going to cost me. It's basically, based on that formula, we input those numbers when it is actually delivered. And so then that's how we compute what the price is at that point. Even though the contract maybe was written months ago and executed months ago, it's going to be fluid in that, we're going to rely on that formula that was stated in the agreement. If we're talking about quantity, you can have some variations in quantity. Normally, a lot of times, if you're going to buy something, you want to know what the quantity is. You don't want that to be the question mark. You want to know how much you need to bring to the table, so to speak, when delivery occurs. But certain types of contracts, you might not know what the quantity is until, performance is rendered. There's two examples that we've talked about. I think I've mentioned this before, but just to kind of make sure, I want to clarify it. There are output contracts and requirements contracts. An output contract is basically you're agreeing for, with whoever the seller is, that you're going to buy their entire production for that time window. So whatever you can make, I'll buy. And usually the reason why you would do this is you want to create an exclusivity for whatever that product is. If it's a requirements contract, this is kind of like the flip side of that coin, where you're basically going to a seller and saying, whatever I need to buy, you're going to be my source point. The requirements contract is a little bit more of a burden on who is the one that's manufacturing or selling the product, because you have to be able to handle whatever that variability is. I think of with requirements, I think of like the toy industry. Think of if you make board games and just games for kids. A lot of times, games and game systems and toys, they're very seasonal. In that like during the holidays at the end of the year, there's usually a surge in the sale of games and toys for children. But when you get into the spring, into the early summer, it tapers off. And so if you're producing these goods for retailers, you have to be able to manage that flow of demand. And if you can't meet that demand, you're going to be deemed in breach then. So you have to be very careful with a requirements contract, because it can quickly escape your capabilities if you can't scale up and provide production as it varies from month to month throughout the year. In terms of the form of the sales contract, as we've discussed with statute of frauds previously, if your sale of goods is $500 or more, it has to be evidenced by a physical writing. It could be digital, but it has to be a writing, as interpreted into the law. The point is, it can't be verbal. If it's under $500, it can be a verbal agreement. The UCC, usually every 10 to 15 years, or as needed, they'll go through a series of revisions or recommendations, and that is adopted or not on a state-by-state basis. And currently, what has been floated is to raise that in writing requirement to $5,000. So to raise it from 500 to 5,000. That hasn't been fully adopted yet, but that's the goal. The other facet of the form of the sales contract involves what's called a confirmation memorandum. And again, all of these different features under the UCC are really a testament to trying to give businesses flexibility as they do what they do, trying to buy and sell products, in the stream of commerce. So the idea with the confirmation memorandum is maybe you had a verbal agreement with another merchant to buy or sell whatever it is that you're trading in. And if one of the merchants kind of goes back to their business and writes everything down from what they remember in a memo or letter form, and then they send it to you, you have 10 days to object if some of the terms are not correct. After 10 days, then you are bound by that as a contract. So that's the confirmation memorandum. It gives a lot of flexibility, for businesses as they buy and sell things. But you do have to be very careful with those details, because if you don't object to a mistake that was inserted in the memo after 10 days, it becomes part of your contractual obligation. The last slide, and this is the last section of this chapter, involves leases of goods. And under Article 2A, so whenever you see 2A, if it's a test question or if you see it in the reading, instantly think leasing of goods. This regulates consumer leases, commercial leases, and finance leases. If you have a lease agreement in physical goods, again, it's not a service, we're talking about physical goods. Under Article 2A, it has to be in writing if the total lease payments are going to be more than $1,000. So if you're leasing, let's say you're a local hardware store and you lease out pressure washers, to whoever, consumers, businesses, whatever, and maybe you rent it out or lease it out, I should say, let's say on a daily basis. Well, okay, if someone leases it for 2 days and it comes to $200, well, that doesn't have to be in writing. It probably will be, but it doesn't have to be. If the lease term is definitely going to be $1,000 or more, then it has to be in writing. When we're looking at the different types of leases, consumer lease, it's anything that's intended for an individual or personal use. So that's a fairly straightforward definition. If we're talking about a consumer lease, that's obviously anything non-personal, so that's going to be for a business purpose. Finance lease, the author kind of explains, that's a transaction where you essentially have three parties. You have the lessor, the lessee, and a supplier. The lessee is the customer. The lessor is the finance company, and they usually direct to the supplier whatever the lessee wants to lease at that point. So, excuse me. So it's kind of a fairly intricate relationship that exists when you enter into like a finance lease, because you have that additional party that acts as like an intermediary between the owner of the good that's being leased versus the person who's doing the leasing. Anyway, as you have questions on the UCC Articles 2 or 2A, please forward them to me. But I hope this has helped clarify some aspects of commercial law that we've discussed in this chapter. Remember the other articles of the UCC we will get into in more detail should you take a business law 2 at some point. So, again, in this course, the main focus is going to be just Articles 2 and 2A out of the Uniform Commercial Code. Have a wonderful, safe rest of your day, and I will be chatting with you all again soon for our next chapter.